Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Headrick. Hi, Christine. Hi, Patricia. All right. Welcome to the first of two sessions, which are a kind of prequel to FHS. Yeah, try and get my light better. Prequel to the FHS conference with emerging scholars doing what promised to be lightning round. Lightning. This is a quick chance to showcase progress and to get back. We've suspended some of our usual rules, French press, to make it more like an in. So you can, if you want to, turn on you will be able to ask questions live and unmute yourself, but obviously please mute yourself, person speaking, so that we don't get any background. And let me say that French Press is an ongoing project. This is now at least second. We've done sessions just about every month, and we have one more April. Hope we'll there and at the conference and elsewhere. And our MC this afternoon is my friend and colleague Lisa Leff, who is director of the Dell Center for Advanced Holocaust Learning, American University, and author of all the archives. Came out when, Lisa? 3 years ago.
7 years ago.
7 years ago. There you go. Time flies. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. And here's how we're going to go. Each presenter 5 minutes. Then we have 10 minutes to question and ask them, and then we move on. Really glad to see you all here. Welcome to French Press. Over to you, Lee.
Judy, thank you so much for your kind introduction. And thank you to you and Sally Charno for giving us these sessions of French Press to do our lightning rounds. This is a series. Our session today is called Futures of French History, Lightning Presentations by Early Career Scholars. Now, speaking as a former president of SFHS from a few years ago now, 4 years ago, I'm thrilled that the conference is back in person in a few weeks, and I see our presidents and organizers here. Hi, everyone. We thought of this program and next week's as a kind of appetizer for the conference, and it's also a way for those of us who are unable to go to the conference to participate a little bit, at least virtually. So there's continuity. We're doing lightning rounds this week with scholars of 20th century France and Francophone history. Next week, early modern, a set of 3 papers. And then at the conference itself, there will be lightning rounds on Saturday morning, the 26th, with yet more scholars of French and Francophone history. So this is our very first. And all 3 of the lightning round sessions will have the same format. Now, we've not done much with this format at our conferences yet, but I'm very hopeful that it may take off, that at least these online sessions will give us enough of a taste to see why they could be useful. It's pretty different than what we normally do as historians, right? We're used to presenting our research. What we're aiming for is deeply researched books that take many, many years to research and then to write. And then along the way, over the years, we take them apart and we present them in 20-minute talks at conferences. We're much less used to boiling them down any farther than 20 minutes to something more like the elevator pitch you'll hear today. So today we've asked our guinea pig scholars to do just that and present their very large research projects in just 5 short minutes. The point of the session is not just to put them on the spot and have them present. It's also to engage you, the scholars of the field. So the way we'll work it is that after each talk, you, all of us in the Zoom room, will get 10 minutes to ask questions or offer feedback. And you too must be fast on your feet because, as Judy mentioned, 10 minutes goes by really fast. I will moderate throughout, but you all will have the ability to unmute yourselves and ask your own questions, and I'll just call on you when you raise your hand. Hopefully, what we want to achieve is not just a quick look at these fascinating individual projects, but also across all three sessions, a broad view of the future of French and Francophone history. Okay, so with that said, let's jump right into our first presentation. Our first presentation is called Contested Commodities, A History of Cannabis and Tobacco in Colonial Morocco. John Dieck is our presenter, and John is a PhD candidate in North African history at the University of Minnesota, Twin City. John will be talking about his dissertation, which draws on archives where he's worked in France, Spain, Morocco, Switzerland, and the United States. He's received research support from numerous sources, including the Society for French Historical Studies and Fulbright-Hague. John holds a dual BA in History and Philosophy from Stetson University. I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out today. I know it's a Sunday and there's many other things you all could be doing with your time today. So I wanted to start with a document I came across in Nantes. It's a 1952 communication from the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Robert Schuman, to the Resident General of Morocco, Augustin Guillaume. Here Schuman warns Resident General Guillaume that France risks criticism in talks taking place at the United Nations. Schuman feared that cannabis' status in French Morocco might give representatives of Arab nations, as well as governments from outside the MENA region, the opportunity to attack the integrity of France's purported civilizing mission. Schuman ends by asking Guillaume to offer his thoughts on the possibility of moving towards the plant's legalization. This document, I think, forces us to ask, if so much was at risk, why was the legalization of cannabis in early 1950s French Morocco not a simple and straightforward matter? The answer to this question is complex and takes us through a surprising array of people, locations, and events. So the main cause for Schuman's concern were the products of the Régie Cointéressée de Tabac au Maroc. It was formed after several European banks purchased concession rights to tobacco and cannabis from Sultan Moulay Hafid in 1911. The business contracted cultivators for tobacco and cannabis, opened regional warehouses, and hired debitants to sell their products. The enterprise became one of the most remunerative in French Morocco. It employed many Europeans and Moroccans, launched an intense advertising campaign, and was present in protectorate political life. Aside from lining the pockets of transnational investors, part of the company's profits also went to the protectorate administration. Yet the European and Moroccan elite were not the only ones trying to profit from tobacco and cannabis. The black market thrived, much to the administration and Reggie's dismay. Moroccan Muslims and Jews, as well as European Christians, smuggled despite threats of fines and imprisonment. Participation also cut across gender and age, with men, women, and children contributing to various facets of the illegal trade. Some traffickers siphoned off tobacco and cannabis from Reggie farms and facilities, and others planted illegal plots around bad tobacco and cannabis. In other cases, they were vended on the street in cafes and from stores. The images here are clippings from various protectorate newspapers as coverage of the latest encounters between law enforcement and traffickers. Martin Thomas and other scholars of empire and policing have argued that colonial police activity reflected not just the colonial political order, but its economic structures as well. The actions of colonial police were driven both by what the colonial state needed to combat threats and what producers and other economic actors required to improve output. Much of the secondary literature studying police work in colonial economies has examined police reactions to strikes and other various forms of sabotage. Yet there are other areas of colonial society where police acted as economic custodians. One of these was the investigation, monitoring, and arresting of contraband traffickers of all types of products in the colonies. The presence of news coverage, like we saw on the previous slide, are testaments to the perceived importance of police work against tobacco and cannabis contraband in French Morocco. So sort of simultaneously going on with the police are local and national events. These shift the impeding of cannabis in particular. During the interwar period, one of the aims of the League of Nations was to address social issues around the world, including drug use. Findings of the LN on cannabis generated global anxiety. After World War II, the creation of the UN, with the creation of the UN drug commissions took on the crusade started by the LN, pushing it even further by demanding nations, colonies, and territories that hadn't already illegalized cannabis to do so. Also in the post-World War II period, the Moroccan nationalist movement intensified, and one of the targets of their criticism was the regime, which they believed helped sustain European control and spread anti-Islamic vices within Morocco. In 1954, approximately a year and a half after the communication between Schuman and Resident General Guillaume that we saw in the beginning, the French administration in Morocco legalized the cultivation, sale, and consumption of cannabis. In light of flagging sale of cannabis products and with the threat of decolonization looming, Freie and French government authorities believed it prudent to quietly outlaw the plant. What had once been policed to protect the colonial economy now became policed according to an anti-narcotic ideology that had local and international origins. The Freie in Morocco continued to function after Morocco's independence in 1956 up until the late 60s, with the tobacco market, in contrast, continuing to be policed to protect the economy of the newly independent nation. So, sort of a bite-sized summary of my research, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. And maybe we'll try to get back into gallery view so we can see everyone. So your sound was, unfortunately for me, at least a little wobbly, but I hope everyone got enough of a sense that you're ready with questions. Ronan, I see a question from you.
Yeah, hi, John. Nice to meet you. I'm Ronan Steinberg from Michigan State University, talking to you from Israel right now. The sound was a bit difficult for me too, but I think I understood the gist of your project, and I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Clearly, you have an intervention also in the history of the French Empire, and it's part of your project. And I wanted to ask how the policing of how shall I call it, intoxicating substances like cannabis, I'm not sure what the legal term is, but how the policing of these kind of substances differs or is the same between the French Empire and other European empires and in Europe itself. I am not familiar with the history of cannabis, so I don't know when Europeans, let's say in Europe, begin to use it, where they get it from, how it circulates, how it's traded. In other words, what I'm trying to understand is whether this is a story of French imperialism, or is this a story of policing illicit or illegal substances, which happens to play out on the French-Moroccan axis, but is not really unique to it. Does the question make sense?
It's I guess if you're comparing the metropole to the colony, you have a sort of a tension going on, and as the 20th century goes on, especially with the formation of these intergovernmental organizations, it shows that really highlights that contradiction on the international stage, because mainland France sort of illegalizes cannabis much earlier than in Morocco and other places. You're asking about other places within the empire, like I'm thinking of Tunisia, where cannabis gets legalized around the same time as Morocco. And so it is a story, I think, of French imperialism, and not just French imperialism. As you said, there might there's similar events going on in other empires, for example, the British Empire. However, I don't focus on those so much more, so I don't have as much detail on those. But I can say with the examples of Morocco and Tunisia, you have hesitation of spreading this sort of anti-narcotic ideology because of the financial motives behind it that is occurring in the colonies. So yeah, I hope that addresses your question.
Thanks. Okay, Judy.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious about the category. How come cannabis, tobacco, opium, definite illicit substance?
That's a very good question, and probably what would be on the first page of any book that I ever write, why these two, I guess, products together. So in North Africa, or I guess the Maghreb more specifically, you have a drug that's called keef, and it's essentially a combination of some percentage of tobacco and some percentage of cannabis, and it ends up being smoked together. And the Reggie sells keef to the protectorate public. So it's really, to properly tell the story of cannabis, you have to at least address tobacco somewhat. But also you see the parallels with cannabis and tobacco in sort of like the black market, where you have both are being moved and sold and grown illegally, and both are being searched by the same authorities. You have police like the Sûreté or the gendarmes, but also monopoly agents who are sort of specifically tasked with seeking out traffickers, and they get kickbacks for finding these traffickers. And it doesn't matter if it's tobacco or cannabis. So that's why I've sort of chosen to look at these two together, which sort of separates them from other contraband going on at the time, like maybe alcohol or some foods like salt or sugar that's going on at this time.
John, I have a quick question. I was impressed by the list of archives or countries in which you looked at archives. How did you decide to go to those places, and what does that tell us about the subject that you're looking at? I mean, I assume it's about the authorities that looked at the question, right?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There's sort of three strands or three interventions going on in my project. I think I addressed one here, which was the policing and how the policing is shaped by the international scene at this time. However, another intervention I'm trying to make, still fleshing out, is on inter-imperial relations. Relations between empires and in their colonies. So how does what happened in one colony affect what's going on in a neighboring colony? And so, as many of you probably know, Morocco is divided between France and Spain. You have the northern strip that's Spanish. And for the Spanish zone, most of the, not tobacco, but cannabis is grown in the Reef Mountains, which is in the Spanish zone. But it just so happens to be right on the border with the French zone. But the French authorities can't really reach it. And the Spanish administration is severely underfunded in Morocco, and they don't really have the boots on the ground to manage the contrabanding that's going on in the Reef Mountains. And so that really affects what happens in French Morocco at this time. You have a sort of flood of traffickers and contrabandists, not just in tobacco and cannabis, crossing this border both ways, and French authorities urging the Spanish authorities to get a grip on it, but they really can't. And so in order to tell that story, I do have to go to Spain, for example, which is one of the other locations on my itinerary, and I'll be looking through the Protectorate administration, the archives there in Madrid.
Thank you. Okay, Headrick.
This is really fascinating. This, to some extent, as I understand, is an opportunity to study the police as well as the commodity. And I'm wondering if you have insights in your study about how police authority evolves over the period of your study. And I'm thinking about two aspects of that in particular. One is, who are the police? In terms of the extent to which they're Moroccans as opposed to French, white French people from France, and also the extent to which police corruption is itself an important aspect of this. And in the handover in the 50s, authority from the French authorities to the Moroccans, how does policing change? That's a lot, but any aspect of that about what you're discovering about the history of policing in Morocco is really interesting.
Yeah, so I'll address first the who are the police, because that's sort of a big question that I have to grapple with in order to adequately explore this topic. You start to see especially, I showed some of the dahirs, especially in the last slide, the legislation basically that's proclaimed by France, but under the guise of the Sultanate. The police aren't who you think they are. They are and they aren't. So you have the traditional Sûreté, gendarmes, local police, I guess municipal level police. But then you have also the Regi agents who technically aren't policemen. Their main goal is to find just tobacco and cannabis traffickers, but they have serious and deep connections with the local police who they call on for help, backup. They help set up sort of stings, if you want to call them that. But then you also have even sort of informal types of policing going on, that the French will, for example, give a certain amount of kickback or money to a local informant for having ratted someone out that leads to successful raid. And those are just a couple of the people who, or I guess groups that can police. The other, so corruption, there's sort of a displacement of corruption that's going on in this period. Within the French sources, you see mostly blame being put on the Spanish for why kief and tobacco are being, I guess, spread around illegally. Basically, you have the good French authorities who are trying to stop this, and it's the bad Spanish, or they don't have their act together, and so it's causing issues for us. And then later on, towards the end of the protectorate period in the mid-1950s, you see the incentive system that existed under the previous, when cannabis was legal, being used to encourage cannabis, finding cannabis under this new anti-narcotic ideology. Because when they took away the kickbacks to find kief, because now it's legal, so we don't really need to deal with it, the police lost an incentive in order to catch traffickers. And now they bring that back in the mid-50s in order to incentivize the police to catch traffickers, because the police can keep sort of the assets of traffickers they find, like cars, houses, money, weapons. And so at that level, you see how corruption sort of guides how the police act within French Morocco.
Hey, well, thank you all for your questions, and John for your presentation. Junko, I see you have a question, but we are actually out of time for this part. So maybe you can chat it to John and we'll keep moving. Junko, I should say, I'm thrilled that you're here because you're the host of next week's lightning rounds. Oh no, at the conference in 2 weeks, right? Okay. Our next presentation is called A Family in Iran, Networks of Love, Learning and Labor in the Alliance Israélite Universelle, 1908 to 1978. And our presenter is Isabelle Headrick. Isabelle is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Texas in Austin, and she too will be presenting her dissertation research. She has already published on aspects of this project in the Journal of the Middle East and North and Africa, and she has another article forthcoming in Jewish Social Studies. Prior to entering her history PhD program, Isabelle worked for 15 years as an affordable housing nonprofit director and developer in Austin. Over to you, Isabelle.
Hey, okay, thank you so much. Thanks for the intro, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see it? Good. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to participate in this. I'll just get into my dissertation, which argues that family work connections within Jewish and educational networks helped to push forward two historical developments in Iran in the 20th century, namely the emancipation and integration of Jews and the advancement of girls and women. And my talk will focus on two objects, a photo and an audio clip that describe the same scene, and that is one small illustration of these processes. Okay, so what are we looking at here? As the caption tells us, the Shah of Iran is visiting a Jewish school in the provincial capital of Hamadan in 1936. And while at first glance, this looks like your sort of run-of-the-mill photo of a dictator visiting a school, like we've seen a million of those, in fact, there's quite a lot happening here. There are various historical processes and personal paths at work that are bringing each of the people into this frame. And by frame, I mean both the photo and the time frame of minutes in which it was taken. And this moment is actually going to set into motion events that will be quite consequential for some of the people in this picture. So the school is one of a network run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a Jewish educational philanthropy that has set up modern French-style Jewish schools throughout the Middle East. The young woman at the right of the picture is Batya Brasseur-Cuenca, an Alliance school director who is also the daughter, sister, and wife, and in the future, mother of other Alliance teachers and directors in Iran. It is her family that is a family in Iran, the family who provides the organizing framework for my dissertation project. So very quickly, this is Batya's family tree. Oops, can you see it? Is the family tree showing? Okay. The parents moved to Iran when Batya was a little girl, and she and her sisters live out their whole lives there. Both of her parents and all of her sisters have worked or will work for the Alliance as school director. So now let's hear the story told by Colette Cuenca El-Ganyan, Batya's second daughter, who is not in this picture. You'll notice that this is the same photo, except now we are looking at it in a picture frame in the apartment of Colette's daughter in Paris, as Colette is narrating what's happening in the scene.
Moi, j'ai la photo. Quand le chat est venu avec son père, et j'ai la photo là quelque part, il s'est arrêté parce qu'il y avait de la poussière. Et il s'est mis à hurler, à tempêter. Vous savez, c'était un nerveux. Hurler, tempêter, qu'il y a de la poussière. Puis il est venu un peu, et maman, elle avait habillé les enfants en marin. Ça l'a beaucoup étonné de voir ça en Iran, vous savez, dans son pays. Il savait très bien où il était. Il s'est arrêté, puis il a regardé, il y avait deux, trois enfants, il y avait ma sœur qui était là au milieu. Il a regardé, il s'est adressé, il a compris qu'elle n'est pas iranienne. Hein. Il lui a dit, dis-moi la fille de qui tu es. Bon, elle, la malheureuse au jardin d'enfants, elle a dit, je suis la fille de ma maman. Alors il s'est retourné au gouverneur, il a dit, qui est sa maman? Alors ma maman s'est approchée, elle a dit, c'est moi. Et tous, ils étaient morts de peur parce qu'ils ont dit, une étrangère qui dirige une école, il va ou la chasser ou la faire prendre. Parce qu'il était comme ça.
Le Shah Reza Pahlavi?
Oui, le père du Shah. Alors il a dit, il l'a regardé, il a dit, tu es iranienne ou étrangère? Très important. Alors son fils a dit, c'est la fille de Brasseur Isfahan. Il connaissait Brasseur, les Kalamkarts. Alors il a regardé, il a dit, oui, nous avons les marins, mais nous n'avons pas les bateaux. Il était tout content, il est parti et tout le monde était très content. Parce que lui, il se gênait pas. Hein?
Okay, so I hope you can understand what's just happened. This is the moment where the Shah, who could be rather brutal and ruthless, encounters a woman who's considered foreign, even though she has spent and will spend almost all her life in Iran, and demands to know her nationality. It doesn't help that she addresses him directly and confidently. And it also doesn't help that Iran is in the middle of a process of nationalizing its private and religious schools. So there's a lot of tension in the alliance around this. Batia is rescued, in a sense, by her family name and her family's reputation. Although, to be fair, she has already burnished her own reputation and will continue to do so until the day she is buried in Tehran and 7,000 people show up for her funeral. But there's something else going on in the picture involving another person here. The girl that you see with the big bows in her hair will have her life transformed by this moment. Her name is Parveen Mohamed. She is Iranian and Jewish, and she is 9 years old. For at the same time, and this is a story told by Colette and Parveen herself, the Shah will see her and say, "This one will get married quickly because she is very pretty." As a result of the fact that the Shah has said this, her family is swamped with marriage proposals. Remember, she's 9 years old, and her parents quickly engage her to a young Jewish doctor, and she's married at the age of 14. So fortunately, her husband is supportive of her continuing her education, and she goes on to become one of the first women in Iran to get an advanced university degree, and in the 1970s becomes the first female and Iranian director of all the Iran-based schools of ORT, another Jewish educational network. So to recap, Batia's family relationships and history have brought her into her professional position and also her state of apparent ease at speaking with the Shah of Iran. So this is something she already shares with her sisters and will with her daughters. And Parveen will be an Iranian woman at the cusp of change, still living within a family system and social environment that marries her off at a young age, but also that nurtures her intellect and pushes her in her educational and professional endeavors. And these two women are connected by their Judaism and their position in this educational environment, but also have in common their position within family and family work networks that not only empower them personally, but in turn help them empower other young Iranian Jews and girls to a greater level of social and economic emancipation and integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. Okay, ready for our lightning question. And maybe I'll just kick us off by asking about the language in which this interaction would have taken place.
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably in Farsi, in Persian. Batia, not everybody in the family was fluent, like her husband, I don't think was ever completely fluent in Persian, but Batia was. And her family members, her daughters and her sisters were fluent. So they would have spoken in Persian in this.
Ian.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, so I realized that this Jewish-Iranian connection in this 1930s through the 1940s, through the Holocaust and everything is quite famous and important. I was just reading a kind of autobiographical history of the family of Claudio Lomnitz, who actually goes to Latin America, and then part of the family ends up being kibbutzers, and maybe part of them makes it to Iran. And so I'm just curious, at a very basic level, what this tells us about these networks, international networks, during the 1930s. And then also just the name, it was what part of the name Cuenca or Cueca or something like this. And so I'm curious if there actually is a Spanish or Latin American connection there.
So it's not a Spanish or Latin American, well, it is Spanish connection, but from very far back. Batia and actually each of her sisters all marry Sephardi men who are from the Ottoman Empire. And so many, many hundreds of years before, their families had come from Spain, but it was actually quite common for Alliance teachers to be from these Sephardi Jews from the Ottoman Empire who had Spanish sounding names. There are quite a lot of Spanish names in that group of teachers and directors. In terms of, I'm trying to trying to remember your first question, but in terms of, World War II is obviously incredibly disruptive, but Iran is a relatively safe place compared to many parts of the world. And so their connection to Jews in Europe is temporarily, is highly disrupted. Their connection to the Central Committee of the Alliance is totally disrupted because the Alliance itself is displaced and can't send them any money, obviously. So this actually strengthens their relationship within Iran with the Iranian Jews, some of whom are really ascending into a middle or even higher than middle class and are able to help subsidize and fund Alliance schools, as are some Iraqi Jews as well.
Thank you. Judy.
Thank you, Isabelle. You started to answer my question, is what happened, sort of 10 years after this graph? What happens 10 years after? What happens 20 years after? What's the longer term? Its relationship to other Jews,
Yeah. So 10 years after, 10 years after is right after the end of World War II. During World War II, Batya and her husband are actually sort of pressed into service for British intelligence. And the family has different roles within, one of the sisters is working for like a Dutch radio network or something like that. So they actually kind of become participants in the war effort from Iran. Afterwards, the Alliance is sort of reaches a peak in the 1950s and 1960s in Iran as the Jewish population has more and more opportunities, but then the Alliance's enrollments start declining as Jews themselves have more and more choices available to them, including public schools and other Jewish schools or schools that they see as more integrated or less French and more English, because English starts becoming more important. And then in terms of, what goes on for the family, I am in touch with the family. Thank you to Cynthia Truitt, who is here in this room, and it is thrilling to have you here. And it's, they are still there. I mean, the youngest, the third generation, some are living in Paris, some are living in Washington, D.C., and they are, some of those third generation married into an Iranian family, a very prominent Iranian Jewish family, actually. And so some of them are quite still hybrid Iranian French. And others are just totally French, and others, have married into American families and stuff. So.
And can you say more about the French identification? Because I was struck by this woman you're interviewing who's choosing to, live her life in France. How, if this family is actually a long time, many generations in Iran, is it the Alliance schools that give them that imaginary, connection?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think that they never stop thinking of themselves as French, which is really interesting over the course of 70 years, because by 1978, they leave. The woman that you heard in the picture, she got on a plane that had just brought Ayatollah Khomeini into Iran. And she basically got on the plane that he had just gotten off of, she and one of her cousins, and they were terrified because the Revolutionary Guard was checking people and pulling a few of them off the plane. And that was one of the last times she was ever in Iran, even though she was already in her 40s and had spent, her life there. So she's very French. And at the same time, funny enough, when I once called her up and she was staying with her daughter was staying with her, they started talking to each other in Persian while I was on the phone with them. And so they still have, especially the ones who married into this Iranian family, they still have a huge amount of love. they served me little Iranian foods, and they, you know, like, so they really feel very hybrid, I think. But but French is kind of like the big international template on which they play out all of these other aspects of their identity, if that makes any sense.
Great project, Isabelle.
Thank you.
We are out of time for your presentation, and we're going to move on to our next one. Our next presentation is called Terms of Exchange, Brazilian Intellectuals and the French Social Sciences, and our presenter is Dr. Ian Merkel. Ian is Alexander von Humboldt Fellow in the History Department, that is the Friedrich Meinecke Institute at the Freie Universität of Berlin. He received a dual PhD between NYU and the University of Sao Paulo in 2018. Ian has taught at Cornell University, at the University of Miami, the University of Turin, and the University of Leipzig. He will be presenting today on his first book, which I believe must grow out of his dissertation. It will be published this May by the University of Chicago Press. Over to you.
So thank you, and you can see my PowerPoint fine. Okay. First of all, thank you everyone involved in organizing this. This is a wonderful new format. And this is in particular people I've exchanged with, Julie Hardwick, Christine Hayes, Patricia Tilburg, Lisa, and then also Sally Charnow and Judith who are here moderating. So thank you. Many of us are familiar with this image here, which is of the Francophonie, which corresponds roughly to the imperial reach of France, right, at its maximum. So, and I think for the past 20 years or so, historians of Greater France have really been doing interesting work on the relationship between France and its empire, whether in the Maghreb, Sub-Saharan Africa, Indochina, or the NT. And this work continues to be quite necessary, I think. There's even people on this panel who are doing this kind of important work. And so what I'd like to suggest in my few minutes here, in addition to talking briefly about the book, is that we consider Francophone and or Francophile spaces that are not immediately visible within the framework of metropole and colony. This could mean, among other places, those countries in green, notably in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. These observers to the Francophonie all have important historical connections with France, and long ones indeed, most of which have been underexplored in Anglophone scholarship. By examining them, we might allow the field, and I think particularly young scholars, to do both French history and the history of somewhere else. My work does this by examining intellectual exchange between France and Latin America, with a particular emphasis on the social sciences. French influence in Latin America is long-standing, reaching its zenith in the 19th century. Walter Benjamin, of course, called Paris the capital of the 19th century, and this was very much the case in Latin America as well. Such influence, if you're an international historian, you might consider as soft power. If you're a colonial historian, some kind of informal colonialism. And it can be seen in, most notably in urban centers of the Belle Époque, such as Buenos Aires, Mexico City, which has its own Campos Elíseos, Champs-Élysées, Rio de Janeiro, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in the case of France, there is the Mexican, or in the case of Mexico, there's the French military intervention. So it's not only soft power. But I'd like to suggest that however much inequality structured these relationships, exchanges and connections went well beyond them and sometimes pushed against them. Despite the relatively small population of French descent, relatively small economic clout of France, France was involved in all sorts of exchanges with Latin America, in diplomacy, in the arts, in the social sciences, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'll do now is talk briefly about my forthcoming book, which is coming out in just 2 months. In particular, what I want to do is to highlight what I see as its major contributions to French history and how it contributes to this broader frame that I've laid out of thinking beyond metropolitan colony. Terms of Exchange examines the role of French scholars in founding Brazil's first university in 1934. This is the University of Sao Paulo. It also examines the importance of the French social sciences in Brazil and the dialogues between French and Brazilian scholars that lie at the heart of two of the 20th century's most significant social scientific paradigms, these being structuralism and the longue durée. The book reconsiders French thinkers that include Claude Lévi-Strauss, Fernand Braudel, and it examines their dialogues with Brazilians, whether they be their students, administrators at the university, local politicians or journalists, or their peers as well, actual scholars. In so doing, the book sheds new light on the Annales School and structuralism, of course, but also on the study of the African diaspora, notably through the anthropologist Roger Bastide, human geography, and multi-ethnic democracy. Brazil and Brazilians, I argue, were crucial partners in remaking the French social sciences from the interwar period and through the post-war period. Of course, this doesn't end, but it takes on different contours after the 1960s. This period that I look at was at once epistemologically and institutionally important. As I show, Brazil and Latin America served prominently at the early days of the École pratique des hautes études, which would become the École des hautes études en sciences sociales, the human sciences branch of the CNRS, and other institutions as well. The image used on the cover of the book illustrates my argument well, and that's all we can do is illustrate in 5 minutes. So the print comes from a book called Quelques Visages de Paris, put together by Vicente do Rego Monteiro, who was a Brazilian printmaker active in, among other places, Paris in the 1920s. In his art book, he sought to Brazilianize and even indigenize Paris. Here, of course, you see the Place de la Concorde with the Seine in front of it, but with the water lilies on the side of the obelisk that are so characteristic of Brazil. So as I close here, I'll say a few words about Laurette Séjourné, on whom I am working now, who is pictured here at the right of the table. This photo was taken in Havana at Cuba's Casa de las Americas, whose archive also is the source of the photo. And this Casa de las Americas was a central place and continues to be in the country's literary and intellectual scene. Séjourné wrote many significant works on Mexican archaeology. She was at the forefront of Mexico's cultural avant-garde in the 1950s and 60s, literature, etc. But she wasn't Mexican. She was raised in France only to flee Vichy and spend her adult life in the Americas. Nonetheless, she operated, at least in part, in French intellectual networks and served as a crucial interlocutor between France and Mexico. Although she wrote in French, most of her books that were published only were published in Spanish translation, and her archives are held in Mexico. These passeurs, these go-betweens, such as Séjourné, I think, help to explain why France and French history has and continues to play a role larger than one might expect based upon its economy, population, or even military. Whether in connected, global, or comparative history, France continues to have a very important role to play, of which the colonial is significant, very significant, but not always the most important element to consider. Latin America shows this, as Eastern Europe does in different ways. And I will close on that point, both because I am here geographically in Berlin, but also as a suggestion, possibly for others. Beyond unexplored historical connections, you will also find that there's actually funding and opportunities for doing French history in the present if you expand the geographical, linguistic, and intellectual frame for what constitutes French history.
Thank you so much, Ian. Question. And maybe I'll just take the opportunity to jump in. and just ask, if are those exchanges, which you rightly point out are not one way, they're two way. Do they also include others? You know what I'm saying? Like Brazil, France, but also perhaps, other nationality. Is it a fully transnational space you're talking about, not just French and Brazilian?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that happens when we talk about these intellectual circulation, et cetera, is we tend to group people into either, kind of local, national, or cosmopolitan international figures. And what that tends to do, I think, is to limit our understanding of the actual paths of circulation. And so I really like the way that Isabelle actually mentioned this about her, figures of, Iranian, that this was, the Frenchness was this international platform through which this circulation. So the people that I study, for example, they were aware of, they had American colleagues, for example, some of them even spent time in the US, but they are much more interested in France, and these exchanges are much denser with France than they are with. So part of this is explaining, why this is the case. Why not with Portugal, which shares the language, or with Britain, which is the economic power until the kind of end of the Belle Epoque? Why is this Frenchness so significant? And so that's, I think, part of answering your question. But the other element that I really wanted to bring into this, and this has to do with the contribution to both French and Latin American scholarship, is just how important the Brazilian elite's understanding of the French Empire was, right? For their own understandings of difference, of multi-ethnic governance, of all of these kinds of things. And this is actually one of the things that makes its way back to France, along with these broader theoretical discussions.
Christine.
Thank you, really, to all three presenters so far. This is very interesting. So I like how all three presentations together are kind of opening up what we think of as France. But just to follow up on what you were just saying, Ian, if you could say a little bit more, like I had known that, say, Roger Chartier from the École des Hautes Études in Paris goes often to Brazil to teach, right? But I had always assumed that was kind of a one-way street. And so I'm curious, could you tell us, maybe give us a few examples of ideas that we associate with French structuralist or analyst school thought that you think are, originating in these transnational connections? Just to give us a few examples of some of the ideas that are coming out of this exchange.
It's funny that you mentioned Chartier, and sometimes when I speak about this for people who are not aware of these long-standing connections, they think, oh, no, I understand why all my French colleagues are always the people who have, ostensibly in their scholarship nothing to do with the country. So there are those inequalities also in my research. I see sometimes people, writing letters, oh, can you, this sociologist, he really is in need of a break, a sabbatical. This is like in the 1950s. Can you fund him for a while just to be there doing his work? He needs a break from his Parisian life. So there is that, and there continues to be that. But then there's also the opposite, the pushback. And so, for example, very basic fact, Lévi-Strauss, he was a philosophy student. Had an agrégation in philosophy before going to Brazil. And it's there that he and his wife, Dina, work alongside Mario de Andrade, who's a kind of pinnacle, the Pope of modernism in Brazil, to start this organization, this Society for Folklore and Ethnography. And it's through that, not just that there's this logistical support for him to become an anthropologist, but also a lot of the ideas are debated, etc. For Brodel and the Annales, a big part of this is actually institutional, and it's just how important geography is in Brazil. So geography and history continue to be very intimately connected. And so there are these, basically fieldwork organizations through which students are discussing things like, commodity expansion, history of capitalism, history of, transatlantic trade, and all of these kinds of things. And particularly, there are two figures that are very important for Brodel, and these are Caio Prado Jr. and Gilberto Freire, both of whom, if we consider them, to say that the Annales are Brazilian is only part of the question, but it is to say that everything that we think of as sort of, longue durée or total social history, or all of these kinds of questions, all of these kinds of methodologies, etc., we can find Brazilian contemporaries who were not just doing this in parallel, but at the same time and corresponding with people like Brodel and Lucien Febvre, etc.
Wow, thanks. I'm going to collect the last two questions from Lynn and Jennifer, and then let Ian, pick. We're running out of time for you. So Lynn first, then Jennifer.
Okay, my question is related to the earlier versions of this. Like, what's the background here? And I'm particularly interested in the French politics link. When I studied spiritualism in the 19th century, the Spiritistes who are left flee in 1870, right? And many go to Brazil, and they take the French version of Spiritism to Brazil, where it flourishes greatly, and then come back later. And I'm wondering, what's the link between French politics and fleeing to France? You mentioned the Vichy, right? And sort of how these earlier exchanges, or how this history of exchanges got set up.
And then before you answer, Jennifer Hoyer.
Just quickly, very interesting. I was actually delighted to see this with a grad student, Andrew Dausch, a few years ago, who worked on Brazil and France. You're nodding, so I unfortunately didn't publish the thesis, but as I'm hearing you thinking that something interestingly connected to ideas of soft power, etc. I like the connections with Isabelle Headrick on thinking about international educational context for negotiating sort of questions of national identity and culture, and their sort of distinctive roles. And especially on the last slide, I think it was the last slide you showed, was wondering about questions of gender, because when we think about these sort of sociological networks, we're thinking about Levi-Strauss, Brodel, sort of the big names. But wondering how that sort of plays out beyond the sort of, the celebrities in the field, shall we say.
Yeah, so these are great questions, and I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can. The first thing is anecdotal, Lynn, and that's actually that Spiritism is not dead in Brazil. It continues to live, it continues on, and in fact, my wife, when she was a child, middle-class Brazilian, actually would go to a Spiritist sort of mass. So Allan Kardec is alive and well in Brazil. And I would just say, and this connects the two questions, coming back to soft power, there's this long 19th century thing, the story, but then there's also the specific 20th century, early 20th century thing, which is of, and why I use diplomatic archives. And that's France is, there's some book that I haven't really looked that much into, Marketing Marianne, about the US context, but there's this going on in Latin America too. And I don't know of other European countries. Germany is quite different, but that the French state in cultural, really takes cultural diplomacy seriously from really, really early on. That has to do with educational institutions, spreading books and cinema and all these. And so that's kind of laying the groundwork for this. And then in terms of gender, and this is precisely what led me into my second project and why I wanted to mention it, if not talk about it more, and that's to bring about much more centrally the history of these women. So Dina Lévi-Strauss, there's work coming out on her, which is why I didn't feel like I needed to touch on her as much, but also for other reasons. But the woman who I'm working on, Laurette Séjourné, she actually, I came upon her, as you often might, through her husband at first. And so Victor Serge, you might know of as the author of Memoirs of a Revolutionary, all of these other things. But then I came across her, who is much more interesting, has written so much more, was this central figure in Mexican archaeology and the avant-garde. And literally, there's not an article written. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, so now we're moving to our fourth and final presentation of the afternoon, and it's called Expanding the Narrative and Meanings of Occupation of France in World War II. And our presenter is Dr. Cameron Zinsou. Cameron is assistant professor in the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In 2021, he received his PhD in history from Mississippi State University. And today he'll be presenting his book project as well. The manuscript is called Occupied: Requisitions, Meaning, and Citizenship in World War II France. It is under contract with the University Press of Kansas. Over to you, Cameron.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks everyone so much for being here on a Sunday afternoon. Really appreciate it. So my project kind of calls into question the standard and understood notions of occupation, kind of what we think about when we think about occupation in France during the Second World War. Traditionally, when we think about it, we think about France's defeat to Germany, and then the subsequent 4 years of occupation from 1940 to 1944. And there's an entire historiography devoted to the German occupation of France and its meaning during the conflict. My project seeks to alter this and to change how we understand by both expanding the time of investigation and to call into question what we mean by occupation itself. And so in doing so, I wrote my dissertation about Montélimar, in southern France, located along the Rhone Valley. And for this research, I conducted research, Municipal Archives de Montélimar, in its home, and at the Defense Archives in Vincent, and at the National Archives, and in various archives during the United States. And my overall argument of my project is that the citizens of France, the entire nation, lived under a state of occupation from the beginning of the Second World War through its conclusion. In fact, this goes beyond the war. Wartime restrictions don't get lifted until several years after the conclusion. But for the base of my project, it's only during the war years. And I argue this because as soon as France declares war, they invoke kind of the tenets of the National Wartime Act that got passed in 1938. And essentially what it allowed the French government to do was to requisition the belongings, and it allowed the quartering of soldiers in civilian spaces throughout the nation. In the United, and this is a concept that is pretty unfamiliar to most Americans because we have the Third Amendment, which forbids soldier quartering in the country. But this is actually seen as part of the French Republican tradition dating all the way back to the Levée en masse during the French Revolution and carrying onward. And so the major themes of my research focus on requisitions and quartering, but really it also focuses on relations between soldiers and civilian population, how the French relate to soldiers over time as the country mobilizes and moves through time and space. There's a Tunisian colonial regiment stationed in the city prior to the outbreak of war, and civilians were strongly identified with it. However, subsequent French units that come through and later occupation soldiers from Italy, France, in the United States, other allied nations, they didn't have that kind of connection. I also call into questions, what it means for the French, both in relation to each other and to the state. So, for instance, the French at the beginning of the war understand that, okay, we have to undergo material deprivation for the good of the nation in order to defeat Germany. But later on, as the Phony War, Toile de Guerre, and later as wartime occupation increases, people begin to be more and more skeptical of the reasons why they have to make these sacrifices over time. And as the war progresses, we also see, these major themes of resistance and collaboration that are more familiar to us as historians of France about the wartime problems that the French had. I'll note that I also chose Montélimar as a site of investigation because they undergo several shifting occupations at the time. So this first period, I argue, happens under the Third Republic and predominantly during the Guerre, from September 1939 to May 1939. Then we have the period of Vichy, where there aren't really all that many soldiers. In fact, there's a demobilization of the French army, and this happens from June-July 1940 through November 1942. And then we have the Italian occupation, which goes from November 1942 to September 1943 in the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. And so the Germans are actually only present in the city of Montélimar for 11 months, from kind of September 1943 to August 1944, when the Allies land in southern France as part of Operation Dragoon. And Montélimar undergoes one of the major battles of this operation is the Battle of Montélimar. And subsequently, we then have the last occupation, which is kind of the Allied liberation occupation, which is kind of this mix of the provisional French government and also Allied soldiers present in the city from September 1944 through the end of the war. And indeed, the last U.S. soldiers don't leave Montélimar until November, December 1945. But again, for the purpose of my project, I stop at it. And so, pending questions, that's kind of a brief overview of.
Cameron, thank you so much. Question? Christine.
Thank you. This great project, and I really look forward to seeing the book. So I have to ask about occupation. In case you don't know, I wrote about occupation of France at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and a lot of the themes that you're mentioning, you can already see in that earlier occupation. But I'm just wondering, since you talked about expanding the meaning of occupation, if you could say a little bit about how people living in Montélimar themselves view the different stages of occupation, right, which are very different, operating according to different legal categories. How are they themselves? Do they use that term throughout this period? Do they see those different at least five different phases the same, or how is their kind of narrative of what's happening to them evolving over time?
Sure. And thanks so much for the question. And so at the beginning of the war, people use kind of small occupation, like these soldiers are occupying my farm, these soldiers are occupying my business. And the majority of them that are passing through are doing so in a transient nature. And so really what it ends up happening is that they're kind of intermittent periods in kind of this first phase during the mobilization of Toile de Guerre. After France's surrender and this kind of unencumbered period where it's not the Third Republic, it's Vichy, but Axis soldiers aren't present. How I kind of frame, because this proves to actually be the most problematic kind of bridging of the notion of occupation I have for my project. And so the reason why I kind of center requisitions as a central theme is that it isn't necessarily what everyone is saying, but the kinds of the conditions under which people are living. And the conditions that people are living under, even if there aren't Axis soldiers present, even if there aren't French soldiers present, continue to manifest themselves in quartering and requisition, right? Whether it's taking your food and a percentage of your crop, taking your vehicle because we need to transport soldiers to the front, or depriving you of your actual living space and quarters. These are all hallmarks of occupation that are talked about so much when we think about the German occupation of France from 1940 to 1944. But in reality, this is occurring, well before the Germans show up in Montélimar in 1939, and it's continuing long after they leave. And so that's kind of what I think about when I think about occupation. And just to know that, it's as much, there's kinds of perception and realities exist. When we think about occupation also, especially in the military, we think about military occupation by a foreign government or a foreign power. It is imposed upon you. And so my conception or exploration of occupation centers also domestic or sovereign occupation of these spaces. Really looks at local people and what they're going through. The kind of a connection that I draw, or parallel that I draw, that might be more relevant to our current living situation, kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how for Black Americans, many of them feel occupied by the presence of police and other security forces within the spaces that they live within every day. And so that it's I don't want to overplay that by any means, but that's kind of the loose kind of comparison I can relate.
Oh. Judy, do you have a question?
I do. Hang on, let me. Oh, I can't. Oh, all right. I can't see very. I can't very well. But I was going to ask you, Cameron, about Le Silence de la Mer. The most famous, sort of symbol about what it means to sort of have the occupier get inside your head, which plainly underscores, again, the symbolic importance of these occupations. Does that have any part in your story? What's your line on Vercors, to put it very simply?
So, La Silence de la Mer makes an appearance kind of in my later chapters where I'm talking about kind of resistance and collaboration, really the resistance of when the Germans are actually present. Because for the citizens of Montélimar, the Germans aren't there for the first 3. And so although they're seeing, the real effects, kind of the occupation of France's defeat and, paying 20 million francs per day, in the occupation of Germany, they don't have kind of a direct face to be resistant to, because for the majority of people in Vichy France actually, give Pétain a chance to, he says he's here to alleviate himself, right? He's here to be the shield that protects us from the worst effects of the German occupation. And so Vercors doesn't really make an appearance in a major way until kind of the obligatory work service gets instituted in later part of 1942 into 1943, and as that kind of ramps up and there begins to be a more active and overt resistance to Vichy and the Axis president.
Eric.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could say anything a little bit more about the liberation of Montélimar. My impression is that it was pretty serious business there. I vaguely remember there were requisitions of some companies and so on, and that the resistance famously can be pretty politically turbulent in these southern towns. What did you find there?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Eric. So what happens kind of when the Allies land is the Germans, they had already begun increasing their crackdowns, especially because there were kind of run and gun battles with resistance members there in 1944 in Montélimar and kind of the home area. kind of a site of major resistance. Mountains and foothills in the area allow for plenty of hiding out. What ends up happening is that the Germans essentially shut down everything. Institute blackouts. You can't go anywhere. They begin summary executions of civilians and forced deportations of others. We also see collaborators. I have Dr. Robert Negre. He's kind of deputy mayor for most of the war, and he flees with the Germans as they leave to Sigmaringen in Austria. And what happens is the Battle of Montélimar is important because the city undergoes a significant damage, and not only that, but the roads in the aftermath of the German retreat are completely clogged with the debris of military weapons, of civilians. Thousands of horses are killed. And so it's there's that kind of aspect of immediate rebuilding and the avoidance of kind of a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in that area. And we also see the liberation government begin to institute itself, kind of resistance members who come in and say, we are now the government. And we begin the persecution, right? The l'Apparition, which the slide depicts, or the image depicts. And there are hundreds of people who are arrested. There are a couple hundred prison sentences. But in my research, to my knowledge, there's only a couple official deaths attributed to the Apparition in Montélimar. Its wartime population was 15,000, so it's not the largest commune by any stretch of the imagination. But you're correct when you say it's heavy business. The mayor Edouard Tardieu gets arrested. He had been the mayor from 1935 through 1944, and he was elected as a socialist at the time. So these kind of local politics that play out over time, right? There's as much about individual resentment as there is much about the big picture. And so I guess I'll say that my project is also about how national defense policy plays out on the local level over time, how it changes and manifests. I guess quickly, the text might be difficult when I get at the bottom, but it's this prisoner who's telling the jailer asks the prisoner, "Hey, what's wrong with you? What's going on?" And then the prisoner is saying, "I do not want to be here with him," referencing kind of the baker who's in active collaboration sharing this as Eddie.
Well, I think we're out of time here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our hosts at French Press. Come back next week, same time. And, I wish all of you well in your future work.